One thing most beginners don't realize is that bourbon isn't just about the brand. It's about the mash bill, the exact recipe of grains used to create the whiskey. A bourbon that leans heavily on corn is going to taste sweeter and smoother, while one with a higher rye content will feel spicier, sharper, and more aggressive on the palate. This is why two bottles that look almost identical on a shelf can taste completely different once you open them. Some of the worst bourbons on the market try to hide weak mash bills behind flashy branding, but experienced drinkers can tell immediately when the flavor lacks depth. On the other hand, the best brands don't need gimmicks because the balance of corn, rye, and malted barley does the talking for them. Understanding this one detail instantly separates casual buyers from people who actually know what they're drinking. Another factor that quietly separates great bourbon from mediocre ones is aging, but not in the way most people think. More years in a barrel doesn't automatically mean better whiskey. In fact, overaging can actually ruin a bourbon by making it too oaky, too bitter, and overly dry. Some of the worst bottles use age statements as a marketing trick, assuming people will equate higher numbers with higher quality. But the best brands understand timing. They pull the bourbon from the barrel when it hits its peak, not when it hits an impressive number. That's why some 6 to 8 year bourbons taste significantly better than certain 12-year ones. It's not about time alone, it's about balance. There's also the question of price, which is where a lot of people get misled. Expensive doesn't always mean good, and cheap doesn't always mean bad. Some of the worst bourbons sit in that awkward middle zone, overpriced for what they offer, relying on brand recognition rather than actual quality. Meanwhile, some of the best bottles are surprisingly affordable because they focus on consistency rather than hype. This is where value becomes the real metric. A great bourbon isn't just one that tastes good. It's one that delivers that quality at a price that makes sense. Once you start thinking this way, your entire approach to buying whiskey changes. Consistency is another underrated trait that separates the best from the worst. A bad bourbon brand might produce one decent batch and then completely miss the mark on the next. That unpredictability kills trust. The best brands, however, are almost boring in how reliable they are. You can pick up a bottle today, next month, or next year, and it will taste nearly identical. That level of control requires serious expertise in blending and quality management. It's not flashy, but it's exactly what keeps people coming back. Then there's the influence of barrel selection, which plays a massive role in flavor development. Bourbon is aged in charred oak barrels, and the level of char, the warehouse conditions, and even the position of the barrel inside that warehouse all affect the final taste. The worst brands often treat this process like a mass production step, focusing on volume over precision. The best brands treat it like an art form. They select barrels carefully, rotate them when needed, and sometimes even blend multiple barrels to achieve a specific profile. That attention to detail is what creates complexity, the kind of flavor that evolves with every sip instead of staying flat. You also have to consider how a bourbon is meant to be consumed. Some are designed for mixing, others for sipping, and a few can do both exceptionally well. The problem is when a brand tries to position a mixing bourbon as a premium sipping experience. That's where disappointment happens. The best brands are honest about what they are. They don't try to be everything at once. If it's a great cocktail bourbon, it excels in cocktails. If it's a sipping bourbon, it stands on its own without needing anything added. Another overlooked detail is the finish, the aftertaste that lingers once you've swallowed. This is where the difference between average and exceptional becomes obvious. A bad bourbon tends to disappear quickly or leave behind a harsh, unpleasant burn. A great bourbon, on the other hand, evolves. The flavors linger, shift, and sometimes even improve after the sip is gone. That's the kind of experience people remember, and it's one of the biggest reasons certain brands build loyal followings. And finally, there's the question of hype versus reality. The bourbon market has exploded in popularity, and with that comes a wave of overhyped bottles that are nearly impossible to find and often not worth the effort. Some of the worst purchasing decisions come from chasing these unicorn bottles simply because everyone else is talking about them. The best approach is surprisingly simple. Ignore the noise and focus on what actually tastes good. Because at the end of the day, bourbon isn't about collecting, it's about enjoying. One of the biggest mistakes people make when choosing bourbon is relying too heavily on reputation without understanding personal preference. Bourbon is not a one-size-fits-all experience. Some people prefer sweeter, smoother profiles with notes of vanilla, caramel, and honey, while others lean toward bold, spicy profiles with heavy rye influence and a sharper finish. The worst brands often try to appeal to everyone and end up delivering a diluted, forgettable experience. They play it safe, avoiding strong flavors in an attempt to please a wider audience. But in doing so, they lose identity. The best brands, on the other hand, commit to a profile. They know exactly what they are and who they're for. And because of that clarity, they deliver a much stronger, more memorable drinking experience. There's also the role of proof, which is something many beginners overlook. Proof refers to the alcohol content, and it has a massive impact on both flavor and intensity. Lower proof bourbons tend to be smoother and easier to drink, but they can sometimes feel watered down or lacking in depth. Higher proof bourbons, often labeled as cask strength or barrel proof, deliver a much more concentrated flavor, but they can also be overwhelming if you're not used to them. Some of the worst brands try to mask poor quality by lowering the proof, making the bourbon seem smoother while stripping away character. The best brands strike a balance or give you options, allowing you to experience the whiskey in its full intensity if you choose. Another factor that separates great bourbon from average bottles is how it performs over time once opened. This is something rarely discussed, but it matters more than people think. A poorly made bourbon tends to fall apart after a few weeks of exposure to air. The flavors flatten, the aroma fades, and what was once decent becomes forgettable. A well-crafted bourbon, however, holds its structure. In some cases, it even improves slightly as it opens up, allowing more subtle notes to emerge. This is a sign of complexity and quality, and it's something experienced drinkers pay close attention to. The environment in which bourbon is aged also plays a surprisingly important role. Kentucky is famous for bourbon production, not just because of tradition, but because of its climate. The temperature fluctuations, hot summers and cold winters, cause the whiskey to expand and contract within the barrel, pulling in flavors from the wood more effectively. Some brands try to replicate this process in other regions, but the results can vary significantly. The worst attempts feel rushed or artificial, lacking the depth that comes from proper aging conditions. The best brands embrace their environment and use it to their advantage, allowing nature to do part of the work. Marketing is another area where the gap between best and worst becomes obvious. Some brands invest heavily in packaging, beautiful bottles, premium labels, elaborate stories, while the liquid inside doesn't live up to the presentation. This creates a disconnect that becomes clear the moment you take a sip. The best brands don't need to rely on that level of distraction. Their packaging might be clean and professional, but it's the consistency of the product that builds their reputation. Over time, word of mouth becomes far more powerful than any marketing campaign. There's also the concept of drinkability, which is harder to define but easy to recognize once you experience it. A highly drinkable bourbon is one that you can come back to repeatedly without fatigue. It's balanced, smooth, and engaging without being overwhelming. Some of the worst bourbons might taste fine in a single sip, but become tiring after a full glass due to harshness or lack of balance. The best ones maintain interest from start to finish. They invite you to take another sip, not because they're aggressive, but because they're well crafted. Another layer to consider is how bourbon interacts with water or ice. A high-quality bourbon will evolve when you add a few drops of water or a single ice cube. The flavors open up, new aromas emerge, and the overall experience becomes more complex. Lower-quality bourbons often do the opposite. They become diluted, losing what little character they had to begin with. This is an easy test that separates depth from surface-level appeal. The role of distillation techniques cannot be ignored either. The way a bourbon is distilled, how carefully the cuts are made, how impurities are managed, how consistent the process is, directly impacts the final product. The worst brands tend to prioritize volume, pushing out as much product as possible with minimal refinement. The best brands focus on precision. They control every step of the process to ensure that what ends up in the bottle meets a certain standard every time. There's also a cultural element to bourbon that influences how it's perceived. Bourbon isn't just a drink. It's tied to tradition, craftsmanship, and regional identity. Some brands respect that heritage and build on it, while others treat it as a marketing angle without truly honoring the process. This difference becomes clear in the final product. Authenticity has a way of showing through, even if you can't immediately explain why one bourbon feels more real than another. And then there's the long-term value of developing your own taste. The more you explore different bourbons, the more you begin to recognize patterns, what you like, what you don't, and why. This personal understanding is far more valuable than any list of best or worst brands. Because at the end of the day, the goal isn't to follow someone else's opinion. It's to refine your own. That's what separates casual drinkers from people who genuinely appreciate bourbon. It's not about memorizing brand names or chasing expensive bottles. This transparency builds trust and allows consumers to make more informed decisions. The worst brands tend to be vague, hiding behind marketing language instead of providing real details. The best brands are open about their process because they have nothing to hide. That openness often correlates with higher quality. Finally, there's the idea of intentionality. Choosing a bourbon shouldn't be a random decision based on what's popular or what's on sale. It should be a deliberate choice based on what you value, whether that's flavor, price, consistency, or overall experience. When you approach it this way, the difference between the best and worst brands becomes much clearer. Because in the end, bourbon isn't just about what's in the bottle. It's about the experience you get from it. And the more intentional you are with your choices, the better that experience becomes.